He lived in a quiet neighborhood, one of those places where everyone knew each other by sight but not necessarily by story. From the outside, his house looked ordinary, a small, well-kept home with a garden that had a few flowers struggling to bloom. The grass was cut neatly, the driveway swept clean, and a small porch light always glowed at night, welcoming anyone who might pass by. To anyone walking past, he seemed like any other man in the neighborhood. Friendly, polite, calm. A man who lived a simple life and wanted nothing more than peace. He liked his life this way. He enjoyed quiet mornings when he could sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, feeling the sun warm his skin while listening to birds chirping. He liked the rhythm of everyday life, fixing small things in his house, running errands, sometimes helping neighbors when they needed an extra hand. But most of all, he liked keeping to himself. There was a discipline about him, a kind of quiet strength that people noticed but didn't fully understand. Some of his neighbors liked to talk to him. The older couple next door waved whenever he walked past. A few children smiled at him when he watered his plants. But no one really knew much about him. They knew he worked hard, that he lived alone, and that he seemed kind and respectful. That was enough for them. And he liked it that way. He had routines. Every morning he woke up early, not because anyone asked him to, but because he liked to start his day with order. He exercised, ran through small drills that seemed ordinary to the casual observer, and tended to the house. To an outsider, these were just good habits, but for him they were a way to keep his mind sharp, to remain ready for anything, even though no one around him could imagine the past he carried silently. It had been years since anyone had glimpsed the man he really was. No one knew that before this quiet life, he had been part of something few people ever experienced. He had trained for situations most people could not even imagine. He had faced dangers that would make ordinary people tremble, but that life filled with missions, secrecy, and survival had ended years ago. He had left it behind, choosing peace, anonymity, and a life where he could just be a man, not a legend. Yet, despite his careful effort to live quietly, not everyone shared his vision of a peaceful neighborhood. There were people who looked for fear, who thrived on intimidation and hate. In recent months, a local gang had begun stirring trouble in the area. They picked on families who were different, who didn't look like them, or who simply lived life in a way they didn't understand. Houses were vandalized, doors were broken, graffiti appeared overnight. It was chaos disguised as mischief, but it left real people feeling unsafe. He had watched the news in silence, had noticed the incidents happening closer and closer to his own street. At first, he told himself it was better not to get involved. But the gang's presence was growing bolder. They would drive slowly through the neighborhood at night, their cars filled with laughter and threats, tossing garbage, leaving signs that marked their disdain. The peace he cherished was being threatened. He didn't panic. Panic had never been his way. He observed quietly, noting the patterns. The same cars, the same faces, the same timing. Every movement told a story. Every laugh in the dark revealed confidence that came from ignorance. They thought they could scare anyone. They thought they could touch people's lives and walk away without consequences, but they did not know him. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun fade behind the trees, he noticed movement in the distance. A group of men lingered near the end of the street, laughing loudly, carrying bottles and sticks. Their behavior was deliberate. They were looking for someone to intimidate. He did not move. He simply watched, as calm and composed as he had been for decades. Every instinct in his body, honed over years he rarely spoke about, told him they were dangerous, but not to him, not in the way they thought. The next morning, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Whispers passed between neighbors about the gang, about the destruction they had left behind at another home 2 streets over. People spoke in hushed voices, casting nervous glances down the block. He listened too, pretending to be a part of the conversations, but inside he was planning, not out of anger but out of clarity. He understood the world in ways others did not. He understood strategy, patience, and timing. He had learned long ago that violence often escalated from misunderstanding and fear. He had learned that the most effective way to handle a threat was to understand it completely before reacting. And so he began to prepare silently, in ways that looked ordinary to the casual eye. Fixing a broken fence, sharpening tools in the garage, organizing his home, yet every movement was precise, deliberate. Every action was measured. Neighbors saw him working and smiled, thinking he was just a man taking care of his home. They did not know the muscles in his arms remembered every rigorous drill, every tactical maneuver, every dangerous encounter. They did not know that this man, who seemed so ordinary, had been trained to survive situations most people could not even imagine. They did not know that beneath the calm exterior lay one of the most dangerous men to have ever served in a uniform few could even dream of wearing. Despite his quiet life, he felt the tension building. The gang's presence had been growing stronger every week. Their laughter grew louder, their confidence more visible, their threats more frequent. And then came the evening when it happened, when their ignorance of who he truly was would lead them into a mistake that would change everything. It started subtly. The usual signs: a knocked-over trash can, spray paint on the sidewalk, graffiti left in bold letters that carried nothing but hate. He observed, as he always did, noting patterns, memorizing faces, recording details in his mind. Nothing about him suggested fear. Nothing about him suggested anger either, at least not yet. His calm was a shield. His patience was a weapon. That night, the gang moved closer. They crossed the street toward his home. He saw them laughing and kicking at the fence, tossing rocks at the garden, tearing at small decorations he had carefully placed. They assumed they were terrifying a man who would cower, who would call the police and tremble behind closed doors. They had no idea that every move they made was being noted, stored, and analyzed. The man did not confront them immediately. He did not scream or shout. He did not run. Instead, he watched. Every angle, every movement, every sound was part of a larger picture he had been building silently for weeks. They were predictable, they were reckless, and they were about to make a mistake they would never forget. By the time the gang left, thinking their intimidation had succeeded, he was already planning the next steps. He would act, but not impulsively. He would act strategically. The chaos they thought they had caused would soon be mirrored back to them, but on terms they could never anticipate. For now, he cleaned up the mess, quietly repairing the small damage done. His hands moved skillfully, fixing what they had broken with precision. It was a strange mix of normal life and hidden danger. Flowers replanted, fences mended, windows checked, locks reinforced. To any casual observer, it looked like a man simply taking care of his home. But in reality, it was preparation. Every repair, every adjustment was part of a larger strategy he had crafted carefully in his mind. Neighbors passed by and smiled. A child waved, and he waved back. No one suspected that the calm, composed man in their midst was someone who had faced dangers that could have broken lesser men. No one suspected that the quiet man next door, the one they saw as polite and ordinary, was someone who could change the outcome of the gang's terror in ways they could never imagine. And as the night fell again, with streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement, he sat on his porch and sipped his coffee, watching the neighborhood sleep. The calm was temporary, he knew. Change was coming. But for now he waited. He waited like a shadow waits for the right moment to move. He waited like someone who knew that preparation was the key, and patience the most dangerous weapon of all. He was quiet. He was calm. He was ordinary. And that was exactly what made him extraordinary. The night was quiet, but that calm was deceptive. He knew the gang had grown bolder, and tonight they would make a mistake. From inside his home, he could hear faint noises outside, shuffling footsteps, low laughter, the creak of the fence. They thought they were sneaky, but he had been observing them for weeks. Every pattern, every movement, every habit was logged in his mind. They were predictable, reckless, and ignorant of who they were dealing with. He remained inside, moving silently. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. He glanced at the broken fence panel from last week, now repaired. He had learned long ago that preparation was as much a part of survival as strength. Every door locked, every window checked, every tool neatly arranged in the garage was part of a plan. And tonight that plan would be put into motion, but not in a way anyone could expect. The gang approached. Their voices grew louder as they neared the front yard. They tossed bottles and debris carelessly, confident that their presence alone was enough to intimidate. He watched their movements through a small gap in the curtain. He noticed the leader's swagger, the way the others followed blindly, assuming they were untouchable. It was almost comical to him. Years of Training had taught him to read people like open books. Each step, each glance, each laugh revealed more than they thought it did. They began at the garden. The flowers he had nurtured over months were crushed underfoot. A small statue that had been a gift from a neighbor shattered on the ground. They laughed and shouted, believing they had caused significant damage. But he didn't react. Not yet. His eyes were calm, his movements measured. Inside, however, his mind was running through scenarios, calculating, predicting. He knew every escape route, every potential trap, and every way to turn their aggression against them without putting himself at unnecessary risk. One of the gang members kicked the gate violently. It rattled in its hinges and the noise echoed through the street. He felt a flash of controlled anger but suppressed it immediately. Anger was a tool, but only if wielded carefully. He remembered every lesson from his past. Patience, observation, and timing were more powerful than brute force. If he acted too soon, he would lose the advantage. The moment had to be perfect. They moved closer to the house, banging on the door, shouting threats. "Where you at? You scared, huh?" their leader yelled. Their voices carried across the neighborhood, disturbing the quiet night. The children 2 houses down stirred in their sleep. The older couple next door peered cautiously through their blinds, worried but too afraid to intervene. And there he was, inside, calm as ever, watching every detail. Then, the inevitable happened. One of them tried to force the door open. He had anticipated this. As the gang leaned in, he quietly slipped into position behind the door. His hands moved with precision, guided by years of training he rarely spoke of. The door opened slightly, and he was ready. His movements swift but controlled. Not a single unnecessary motion. Not a sound beyond what he intended. The gang stumbled back, startled. The man's presence was sudden, almost ghost-like. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He simply stood there, calm, observing them as if they were children caught in a game they didn't understand. The leader's confidence wavered for the first time. "What the hell?" he stammered, glancing at his friends who were frozen in shock. The man's voice was steady, low, and calm. "I suggest you leave," he said. There was no threat in his tone, just quiet authority. It was a voice that demanded attention without needing to scream. Years of experience had taught him that fear was most effective when subtle, when it came from understanding that the person in front of you could act decisively if necessary. One of the gang members laughed nervously. "Or what?" he challenged. They didn't realize that the man's mind was already 3 steps ahead. Every escape, every reaction, every attempt to fight back, they had been calculated. The humor in their challenge was almost tragic to him. They were ignorant of the power they had triggered. A small rock rolled from the leader's foot and the man's eyes followed it. Every movement, however minor, was significant. He moved with precision, blocking potential threats without alerting the others to how much he was in control. One by one, the gang began to hesitate. Their confidence, which had been loud and aggressive moments before, started to crumble. They could feel it, but they didn't understand why. The man didn't need to fight yet. He allowed their fear to grow naturally. He spoke calmly, almost conversationally. "You think this is funny? You think destroying someone else's home proves anything?" There was no anger, no emotion, just calm logic. And logic, in situations like this, was more frightening than any physical force. They shuffled their feet, unsure, confused. Some tried to regain control, shouting insults, but the man ignored them. Every movement they made was being recorded, analyzed, noted. He had spent years learning to predict behavior, and now he was doing exactly that. The gang, in their ignorance, had walked straight into a situation they could not control. Then the leader tried to push further. One aggressive step toward him, and the man moved with speed that was almost invisible. He stepped aside, gently, but firmly guiding the leader backward without causing serious harm. It was a display of skill that left the others frozen in shock. They had underestimated him completely. The fear in their eyes was now real. They were no longer in control. They were on his stage, and he was the one directing the scene. The man didn't raise his voice, didn't strike them. He simply stood there, observing, allowing their mistakes to reveal themselves. A bottle rolled from one of their hands, clattering loudly on the pavement. Another tripped slightly over a curb. Each moment, each error, built the tension and made the gang realize their misjudgment. The ordinary man in the house, the quiet neighbor, was anything but ordinary. Finally, he spoke again. "Leave. Now. Before this gets worse for you than it already has." His words were calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind them, a promise that consequences would follow if ignored. The gang hesitated, looking at each other, unsure of what to do. They had never faced someone like this before. The laughter, the bravado, the confidence, all drained away under the quiet authority of the man they had intended to intimidate. One by one they retreated, stumbling back down the street. Their footsteps were fast, uneven, panicked. Their laughter was gone. In its place was the dawning realization that they had miscalculated entirely. They had targeted someone who could have destroyed them in ways they couldn't have imagined. But he had chosen restraint. He had allowed them to leave, but the lesson had been learned. The neighborhood would remember, even if they didn't. He watched them disappear into the darkness, breathing quietly. The night returned to its calm, almost serene state. No one outside knew what had happened. The children remained asleep, the neighbors remained unaware, and the streetlights continued to cast long shadows across the pavement. Only he knew the truth of the night, the truth of how dangerous a man could be when pushed, and how careful, calm patience could control situations that seemed impossible. After ensuring the doors were locked and the house secure once again, he began cleaning up the small damage the gang had caused. Broken flowers, scattered debris, scratched paint, all repaired with the same careful precision he had applied in his daily life. He moved quietly, almost ritualistically, as if restoring order after chaos was not just a task, but a necessity. It was a method of reclaiming control without drawing attention. Sitting later on the porch, he sipped his coffee and reflected. He didn't feel victorious in the way others might imagine. There was no joy in seeing the gang retreat, no rush of adrenaline. He felt calm, satisfied that the situation had been handled effectively and with restraint. This was his life now, not fighting wars across oceans, but facing threats in his own neighborhood with the same focus, the same discipline, the same calm that had always defined him, and he knew that this was only the beginning. The gang had made their mistake and they would not forget it. He would remain vigilant, watching, learning, and ready. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Because peace, once threatened, had to be defended. And he was a man who knew how to defend it better than anyone could imagine. The night grew colder, the wind whispered through the trees, and the street returned to silence. He finished his coffee, set the cup down gently, and went inside. The candor lights dimmed. The house fell silent, and the quiet man returned to his simple, disciplined life. But outside, somewhere in the shadows, the lesson had been etched into those who had thought themselves fearless. He was calm. He was ordinary. And that ordinary man had shown the extraordinary power of patience, strategy, and hidden strength. The morning after the gang's retreat was quiet. Birds sang, cars passed occasionally, and the sun slowly rose over the street, casting warm light across the neatly kept houses. To anyone looking, it was just another peaceful day in the neighborhood. But inside the house of the quiet man, the air was different, charged with focus and purpose. He did not waste a single moment. The attack, although minor, had revealed a weakness in the neighborhood's sense of safety, and he knew he could not let that go unchecked. He began by observing the neighborhood from his porch, just as he had done countless times before. But this time, he was not simply noting patterns of life. He was looking for details about the gang. He noticed how certain cars would slow as they passed, how shadows moved differently in the evening, and how even the smallest gestures could reveal intentions. To an ordinary person, this would seem obsessive. To him, it was strategy. Every movement, every behavior was part of a larger story that he intended to understand fully. The first step was intelligence. He began collecting information subtly. He noted the license plates of cars he had seen before, recognizing which vehicles belonged to which members. He observed who gathered together, who spoke loudly, who seemed to follow the leader without question. He learned their habits, their patterns, their routines. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle, and he carefully pieced it together in his mind. He also listened. The sound of voices carried further at night, especially when people were confident and unaware. Conversations overheard from a distance revealed names, plans, and conflicts within the gang itself. Some members complained about the others. Some boasted about actions that had gone unnoticed by the law. Each snippet was a clue. Each word added to the picture he was building. Despite his focus, he remained calm, almost meditative. He did not rush, did not act impulsively. Years of training had taught him that haste was the enemy of success. Patience, observation, and preparation were far more powerful than any sudden act of force. And so he watched day after day, building a mental map of their movements, learning their weaknesses without drawing attention to himself. He also studied the neighborhood itself. The layout of the streets, the timing of streetlights, the distance between houses, even the smallest details like trash bins and mailboxes, all became part of his plan. He knew where the gang would likely appear, how they might attempt another attack, and how to anticipate their next move. He did not feel fear. He felt readiness. He did not feel anger. He felt clarity. At the same time, he began discreetly reinforcing his own home. Locks were checked twice, small security measures added, paths of entry carefully observed. Every action was subtle, so as not to alarm the neighbors or reveal the seriousness of the situation. From the outside, he looked like any ordinary man preparing for minor household maintenance. From the inside, he was constructing layers of safety and control that would serve him if the gang returned. He also started thinking about the gang in human terms, not just as threats. He considered their habits, their weaknesses, their arrogance. Most of them were inexperienced, untrained, overconfident, and impulsive. Their decisions were predictable because they were not guided by knowledge or discipline, only by ego and bravado. He understood that ego was their weakness, and he intended to use it carefully. He found satisfaction in subtle victories. A car observed parking in the wrong place. A member of the gang talking too loudly about something he shouldn't. Each small insight gave him more control over the situation. Each mistake they made was another step toward preventing greater harm. He had learned long ago that power was most effective when unseen, when control was exercised silently and with patience. The days passed, and he continued his quiet work. He did not confront the gang directly. That was not yet necessary. Every interaction, every observation, every note he made in his mind was a step toward a larger resolution. He moved through the neighborhood with calm, collected composure, waving at neighbors, smiling at children, repairing small things in the garden. All the while he was thinking, planning, and preparing. Then one evening he noticed something different. The gang had gathered again, not far from his home, and this time they were boasting loudly, almost carelessly, about the attack they had carried out. They laughed, thinking no one had noticed their arrogance. They did not realize that they were being observed, that their every movement, every word, every boast was being recorded silently in his mind. He watched them for hours, noting the leaders' patterns, the weaknesses of individual members, and the way they relied on each other. Some were reckless, some cautious, some eager to impress, some lazy. All of it was valuable. All of it would be used when the time came. He did not rush. He did not act on impulse. He merely watched, learning, waiting for the right moment to act in a way that would ensure safety and justice without unnecessary chaos. He also noticed the effect the gang had on the neighborhood. People were fearful, whispering, avoiding the streets at night. Children stayed indoors. Neighbors looked worried, unsure of what to do. He felt a quiet responsibility. It was not enough to protect his own home. The neighborhood needed reassurance, even if they did not know it came from him. He thought about the lessons he had learned in his past life, the importance of preparation, the value of strategy, and the strength that comes from calm control. At home, he began putting together a more detailed plan. Maps, routes, and possible scenarios played in his mind. He considered the best way to intervene if the gang returned, the safest way to protect himself and the neighborhood, and the most effective method to prevent further attacks. He did not consider revenge. That was not his way. He thought of protection, deterrence, and ensuring that the arrogance of those who preyed on others would be curtailed. He practiced mentally, visualizing every possible scenario. He imagined the gang entering his yard again, predicting their reactions, calculating their mistakes, and planning his responses. Every move was rehearsed in his mind, every possible outcome considered. By the end of the evening, he felt a quiet confidence, knowing he was ready if the situation arose again. Despite the seriousness of the situation, he maintained the appearance of normalcy. He spoke to neighbors, helped carry groceries, fixed a fence here, planted flowers there. To them, he was simply a helpful, polite man living quietly in his home. No one suspected the depth of his preparation, the intensity of his focus, or the skills that lay beneath the calm exterior. As nights passed, the gang continued to make mistakes. Their overconfidence led them to linger too long, to speak too loudly, to assume that no one was paying attention. Every misstep was noted, every action added to the picture he was creating. A detailed mental map of who they were, how they acted, and how they could be stopped without unnecessary violence. He also used his knowledge to predict the leader's decisions. The leader relied on bravado and intimidation, not on real skill. He would act rashly, and the man knew exactly when and where the gang would make mistakes. Patience was key. Letting them reveal themselves, letting them stumble, was more powerful than confronting them head-on. One day, while observing from a distance, he noticed a small argument between two members of the gang. One blamed the other for not watching the house closely enough during their previous attack. Another laughed, claiming the destruction had been enough to scare anyone. The man noted it all. Internal conflict was a weakness, and it would serve his purpose perfectly when the time came to act. The neighborhood, unaware of the quiet storm brewing, continued its daily routines. Children played, cars drove past, and life seemed peaceful. But in the shadows, a man was preparing. Not for revenge, not for aggression, but for safety. He was readying himself for the moment when the gang's arrogance would give him the perfect opportunity to act decisively, to restore peace, and to ensure that fear could no longer thrive in his community. By the end of the week, he had a complete understanding of the gang's habits, their weaknesses, and the best way to approach the situation. He knew where they gathered, when they moved, and how they operated. He had rehearsed in his mind every possible scenario, ensuring that he could act quickly, effectively, and safely. And yet, he remained calm. That calmness was his greatest strength. It was the quiet force that allowed him to think clearly, to plan carefully, and to act with precision. It was the calm that the gang had underestimated completely, and it was the calm that would allow him to turn the situation around without unnecessary conflict or chaos. As night fell, he prepared himself for the next steps. Tools, equipment, and small preparations were quietly arranged around the house. Nothing was left to chance. Every detail, no matter how small, had been considered. Every potential risk had been evaluated. He was ready, not because he wanted to fight, but because he knew that protection required readiness, observation, and strategy. He looked out at the quiet street, the shadows stretching long under the streetlights, and felt a sense of focus unlike anything he had experienced since leaving his past life. The neighborhood was peaceful now, but he knew that peace was fragile. The gang's arrogance and ignorance would lead them to act again, and when they did, he would be ready. For now, he waited. He observed. He prepared. And when the time came, he would act, not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of clarity, discipline, and a deep understanding of how to restore balance and protect those who could not protect themselves. He was quiet. He was ordinary. And yet beneath that ordinary life lay a man capable of extraordinary action, a man whose patience, strategy, and readiness would ensure that chaos could not take hold. The night was darker than usual, clouds drifting across the moon, leaving the streets dimly lit. The quiet man stood at his window observing. He had waited patiently, gathering intelligence for days, carefully watching the gang as they continued to make mistakes and reveal themselves. Now the time had come to act, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. The neighborhood's peace had to be restored. He moved quietly through the house, his footsteps silent against the wooden floor. Every action was deliberate, controlled. He checked doors, windows, and the small pathways around the house one more time, ensuring everything was in order. Then he slipped into the garage where small preparations had been arranged carefully. Nothing was flashy, nothing unnecessary. Everything had a purpose. Every movement had been rehearsed mentally for days, every detail planned. Outside, the gang had gathered again, not far from his house, unaware that this time their arrogance would meet consequences. They were loud, boisterous, and overconfident, talking about their previous attacks as if they had been untouchable. He observed them from a distance, noting the leader's gestures, the way the others flinched when he spoke, the subtle cracks in their overconfidence. Each small sign was part of a pattern he had been studying for weeks. He stepped outside silently, moving into the shadows of his own yard. The night air was cool against his skin, and the soft rustle of leaves was the only sound. He had no weapon in his hand, no need for a visible display of force. His presence, his calm, his control of the situation, those were his weapons. Years of training had taught him that power was most effective when hidden, when the opponent underestimated it. And now, that lesson was about to be proven. The gang noticed him eventually. At first they laughed, thinking it was absurd that someone would confront them alone. "What's he gonna do? Hit us with flowers?" one of them joked. The others chuckled, their bravado still intact. But there was a hesitation now, subtle, almost imperceptible. Something in his calm posture and the quiet intensity of his gaze began to unsettle them. He did not speak immediately. He let them stew in their overconfidence, letting their own arrogance become a trap. They moved closer, thinking to intimidate, thinking that this was the same man who had been passive before. They had no idea how wrong they were. Then, without a sound, he shifted his position, moving with precision and grace that seemed almost unnatural. He positioned himself where he could control the space, where every possible action the gang might take could be observed and anticipated. His movements were smooth, silent, efficient. They were not aware that every step they had taken so far had been calculated, and now, he was the one calculating, directing the flow of events. The leader stepped forward, trying to reassert control. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice a mixture of bravado and nervousness. But his eyes betrayed uncertainty. He was beginning to realize that this was no ordinary man, no ordinary neighbor. The quiet man spoke softly, his voice calm but firm. "I suggest you leave now. You've caused enough trouble. I won't warn you again." There was no anger, no threat, just clarity and authority, and yet that clarity carried weight. The gang could feel it even if they could not understand it. One member tried to laugh it off, stepping forward, but the man's eyes followed every movement. The subtle shift in posture, the slight overextension of a hand, the nervous glance, all were noted. With minimal movement, he guided the man back, using just enough pressure to disrupt his balance without causing harm. It was controlled, precise, and unexpected. The gang froze. "You think this is funny?" the man asked quietly, letting the silence hang in the air. "Do you enjoy making others feel small, unsafe, or afraid?" His calm, unwavering gaze pinned them in place. No one moved. No one spoke. Their confidence, so loud and visible just moments ago, had drained. A bottle fell from one of their hands, clattering against the pavement. Another stumbled over a curb, recovering clumsily. The quiet man did not laugh, did not celebrate. He merely observed. Each mistake, each misstep was part of the pattern he had been waiting for. They had revealed themselves, and now it was time to act, not recklessly but effectively. He began to dismantle their confidence methodically. Using his understanding of their movements, he guided them into positions where they were vulnerable. Not physically necessarily, but psychologically. They began to realize too late that they were trapped in their own overconfidence. The quiet man moved silently between them, his presence dominating without a single aggressive action. "You've made your choices," he said softly. "Now live with them, or change them." The weight of his calm, the intensity of his control struck them harder than any weapon could have. Panic began to seep in, subtle but undeniable. They looked at each other, uncertain, realizing that they had underestimated the man they had attacked weeks ago. The leader tried to assert himself once more, moving aggressively. But every step was anticipated. The quiet man's movements were precise, guiding the leader away from the others, isolating him without causing unnecessary harm. Each member of the gang now felt the shift. The one they had thought powerless was now fully in control. By the time the confrontation ended, the gang was shaken. They were disorganized, fearful, and uncertain. They had walked into what they thought was an ordinary man's home territory, only to find themselves completely outmatched, not by strength alone, but by strategy, patience, and control. They had no choice but to retreat, stumbling back down the street in confusion, their laughter gone, their arrogance shattered. He watched them leave, standing silently in the dim moonlight. The neighborhood was safe again, not because of chaos or aggression, but because of precision, understanding, and restraint. He did not pursue them. He did not gloat. He simply ensured that the immediate threat had ended, that the balance had been restored. Once the gang disappeared into the distance, he returned to his home quietly. The doors were checked again, locks confirmed, paths secured. Everything returned to normal. The quiet man moved through his home as if nothing had happened, but inside his mind remained sharp, aware, and vigilant. He had acted decisively but with control. The neighborhood had not witnessed violence. They had witnessed calm restoration. Sitting on his porch later, he reflected on the events of the night. He did not feel victorious in a traditional sense. There was no rush of adrenaline, no thrill of aggression. There was only satisfaction in order restored, in the knowledge that patience, observation, and strategy had achieved what reckless aggression never could. He understood that the gang's behavior had been a test and he had passed, not through violence but through discipline. Neighbors continued to sleep, unaware of how close danger had come. Children played inside their homes and the streets remained quiet. To them, the night had been ordinary, but to him it had been a demonstration of control, a confirmation that preparation and calm thinking were far more powerful than fear or recklessness. He repaired small damages once more: scratches on the porch, footprints in the garden, minor disturbances caused by the gang. Every action was quiet, almost ritualistic, as if restoring the neighborhood's peace was a personal responsibility he had silently accepted. The calm man understood human nature deeply. He knew that fear, when handled correctly, could be a tool for teaching respect without causing harm. He knew that arrogance, when confronted with patience and precision, would crumble. And he knew that the neighborhood would feel safer, even if they never understood why. As the night grew colder, he finally returned inside, shutting the doors quietly behind him. He took a deep breath, feeling the stillness settle over the neighborhood. The immediate danger had passed, but he remained vigilant. He knew that others might test the peace in the future, and he knew that he would be ready, not out of desire for confrontation, but out of responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. He was quiet, calm, and ordinary in appearance. And yet, beneath that exterior lay a man capable of extraordinary action, a man whose strategy, patience, and control had restored balance without chaos. The neighborhood would never know the full story, but they would benefit from the results. And as he sat alone in the dim light of his home, he understood that true strength was not measured by aggression, but by restraint, observation, and the ability to act decisively when it mattered most. The gang had learned their lesson, not through fear of harm, but through the quiet certainty of a man who had never underestimated them, and they never would again. The morning after the confrontation was calm. The street was quiet. Birds sang and sunlight spilled across the neighborhood, washing over the houses that had long felt tension and fear. To anyone walking by, it seemed like another ordinary day. Children ran to school, neighbors greeted each other, and the rhythm of life continued. But for the quiet man, the day carried a sense of fulfillment, not triumph. He did not seek recognition or applause. He only wanted peace and safety for his home and the neighborhood he cared for, even if no one truly knew why. He moved through his house deliberately, tending to the small repairs that had been left behind after the gang's previous visits. Broken flowers were replanted, footprints washed away, fences checked again. Each action was small, almost invisible, but each restored a sense of normalcy. He worked quietly, methodically, knowing that these details mattered. They were symbols of order restored, a subtle reassurance to himself that chaos would no longer be allowed to take hold. The police had been called by neighbors during the previous night's disturbance, but by the time they arrived, the gang was already gone. No one could have predicted what had truly happened. No one could have known that the calm man they had underestimated was the one who had ensured the gang's retreat. The law would handle the aftermath now, but he knew that real security came from preparation, vigilance, and the quiet assertion of control that he had already applied. He decided to visit the local convenience store. On the way, neighbors waved, children smiled, and a small dog barked playfully. He returned their greetings politely, showing the same calm demeanor he always had. No one suspected the depth of what had occurred, and that was exactly as he preferred. Heroism in his mind was not about recognition. It was about ensuring safety, maintaining peace, and being prepared to act when it mattered most. At the store, he overheard fragments of conversations about the gang. People were nervous but relieved, speaking in hushed,